Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory.
All right, so Daniel 11, starting in verse 21, and let's just read together this block of text. I'm going to read down. It's kind of be a long reading, but I'm going to go ahead and read down through verse 35, starting in verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from time to time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. He shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. Now, what does that expression mean? I'll just kind of stop and what does that mean? Even those who eat his food shall break him. Yeah, people that are close to him, people that dine at his table. These are people who would have access to the palace. His confidants, his trusted. Well, all kings have a court, an entourage that works. Even our president, who's not a king, has his cabinet, and then has the other people in his administration, the chief of staff and the various communication director and all those different. These are his close advisors that help. These are the people that it's talking about when it says, even those who eat his food shall break it. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. I'm going to stop here just a moment again, simply point out that what that's saying is that he is going to be able to, with his speech, with his flattery, draw some people away from God, but there are going to be some who stand firm in faith and who stand with God. The wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. All right, so we've got this king who is now rising, and he is set against the two kings from the previous section, the king of the north and the king of the south. He is contemptible. He's described as being contemptible, as being crafty, and as a ruler, he is quite savvy. He doesn't honor the covenant, which means what? He has no respect for the law, particularly the law of Moses. He has no respect for God. This is not somebody arising from among the Israelites. This is a Gentile who is not a respecter of the covenant that God made with man. He exploits flattery. And by the way, this pretty much describes every power hungry individual that's ever lived on earth, is in terms of the tools of the trade. Flattery, he sees his power, um, and then persecutes God's people, is what's described here. That is, again, that is what all of these kinds of rulers do. They attack the people who stand for what is right and what is righteous. That is threatening to them. Um, he sets up, well, let's look at verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress. So he goes into the land of Israel, right? Profanes the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. So it's under this rule that there is no longer any activity in the temple. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. The abomination that causes desolation. And you might recognize that language. That language is echoed in the New Testament at times as well. And it is not, I don't believe, intended to be understood here as a particular event that is going to take place. It is a description of things that happen periodically. It was happening in that day. It's going to happen again, according to the Lord, when he taught in Matthew in Jerusalem. And that would be when? Well, when the Romans went in and destroyed Jerusalem. And so I think that language, abomination that causes desolation, or abomination of desolation, that language just simply mean it gets really bad. And control is lost, and all ability to worship God is cut off. And that's what he's describing. He is describing how bad the persecution against the righteous ultimately will become. Daniel is thinking, hey, when we get to go home, everything's going to be back like it ought to be. And God is saying what? No. You got this king that's going to do this. You got this king that's going to do this. You got this other king that's going to rise up, and he's going to be willful and not have any respect for the covenant of God. He's going to come over here and just stop everything from happening. Their hope wasn't getting back to Jerusalem. What was their hope? By the way, the Jews in Christ's day had made the same mistake that generation made, and that people today make. Premillennialist doctrine is built on the idea that Jerusalem has to be restored, and that somebody's got to be on the throne in Jerusalem, and that nation has to be great. And Daniel is being told, look, even when you go back, it's just going to keep happening. There's going to be this king, there's going to be this king, there's going to be this third king that's more powerful and wealthier than all of them. And he's going to come from a tiny little nation without very many people, but he's going to wield an unusual amount of influence. And that's going to extend all the way to Israel. And he's going to control Israel and even cut off your ability to worship. So Daniel going back at the end of this 70 years doesn't mean that the persecution ends. And then everybody else that reads this book learns the same lesson. When does the persecution end? It doesn't until the end of all things, until Christ's return. And so I don't believe, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute in some more detail. I don't believe, and I think I have all that. Well, yeah, I'll talk about that in front of chapter 12 because it goes back to chapter 7. I'm trying to decide what order I want to do some of this stuff. I think I have it in my notes in the wrong place. So I'll try to finish this chapter, and then we'll go back and look at something that appeared back in chapter 7 and then appears again in chapter 12 that I want to get cleared up before we get into chapter 12. So anyway, let's just keep looking at this. I just stuck a whole, like, 2 pages of notes in the wrong place. There is something much larger that God is doing than those immediate physical snapshots in time. In fact, the whole carrying away for 70 years and the restoration is only a small action on God's part to accomplish something much bigger. Why were they carried away captive for 70 years? What was the purpose of that? How did Daniel and his friends end up in Babylon? Okay, they were taken by the Babylonians, went in and invaded Israel and carried the people away. Why did that happen? Was it simply because Babylon was so powerful? Is that why it happened? God was disciplining them. They were not doing the will of God. And so God was using the Babylonians to enact discipline against them to bring them back to a point where they would once again care about God, care about the law, care about obedience to the law. That was just a small part of God keeping Israel where it needed to be in order for Christ to be brought into the world. Now, do they know that? No. They know that they're being disciplined if they've read the prophets, because the prophets warn them that. They know they're being disciplined if they read the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy says, hey, as long as you keep my statutes, you'll live in the land forever. But if you don't keep my statutes, what's going to happen? All of these plagues that we just talked about, that you're going to be protected from, all these things are going to happen to you. And so they knew that it was the result of discipline on the part of God, or they should have known. But what they had not pieced together at that point, and what I don't think I could piece together if I didn't have the benefit of hindsight and the rest of the revelation of God, is that that was only a small step in this thing that God's trying to bring about, which involves bringing the Messiah and establishing his kingdom and his spiritual kingdom. And again, each one of these visions that we've seen in Daniel has given us a glimpse of, this is where I'm going. You've got this king, this king, this king, this king, but there's going to be a kingdom that arises not made with hands. That's where this is going. So that's part of what's going on here. I'm not convinced that the willful king needs to be understood as being a specific individual. I think it describes Alexander the Great fairly well and what Alexander did. But I think it could describe other people like him that have arisen from time to time. And that becomes a little bit significant as well. All right, I got to skip over all these notes and we'll finish this chapter and then I'll go back to those things. So let's pick up the reading in verse 36. And we get the final period and the resurrection of the saints being described here. The king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. Who's the God of gods? He's the King of kings and Lord of lords, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of God. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, nor to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other God, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign God. Those who acknowledge him shall load with honor. He shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, with many ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overthrow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out of his hand against the countries and against the land, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. So the willful king's arrogance is denoted. His acts go on according to his own will, exalting himself above everything else. But ultimately, he's going to be defeated. And again, cautionary tale for all people. It doesn't matter how great you become. And let's just apply this to Alexander the Great for a moment. Why is he called Alexander the Great? Because he was great. He was an amazing military leader. He accomplished more with his armies than anyone had ever accomplished. He controlled a greater portion of the earth than anyone had ever controlled. As glorious as Nebuchadnezzar had been, Nebuchadnezzar's control looked trivial against Alexander the Great's. But where is Alexander today? Where is his kingdom? Doesn't exist. And that's the lesson, and it applies to every human situation. No matter how great you become, no matter how powerful you are, how rich you are, how far your influence can reach, human power, human wealth, human influence will not stand. And that arrogance on the part of man happens over and over and over again. As people rise to power and prominence and they control their dominion, however big or small it is, they begin to think they can do anything and nobody can stop them. And in their little realm, it may even seem that way for a while. But eventually, what happens to all of them? They fall. You can apply that, and again, I'm not applying this prophecy to these individuals. I'm using these individuals as illustrations. Jeffrey Epstein controlled his little part of the world. He had a lot of influence. He had a lot of power. He did what he wanted to do. He ignored laws. He went where he wanted to go. He had the means to accomplish whatever he wanted to do. But eventually, what happened? He was exposed. And you can go down the list and see that over and over again. Sometimes it happens after they die. All the truth comes out. Sometimes it happens before they die, and it's part of their downfall and loss of wealth and control at the time. Sometimes they end up imprisoned for what they've done. Sometimes they don't. They escape. If you put this on world leaders, you've got the Marcoses in the Philippines. Whether you believe they're good or bad, doesn't matter. They had this power, and they lost it. But unlike a lot of dictators who fall, they weren't executed. What happened to them? They moved to Hawaii and lived out the rest of their life in exile from home, and not as powerful as they once were, not as wealthy as they once were, but in relatively comfort and ease. In fact, by most of our standards, in palatial comfort and ease. That happens to some, but again, where's that power today? Well, it doesn't exist. That is a recurring story about human dominance and control. Somebody comes up against you. Sometimes it's an old rival. The king of the South comes back into this discussion. Look, the king of the South was defeated already, but now here they are again, reorganized. Let's again apply this for illustrative purposes, not making application of the prophecy to the event, but for illustrative purposes. A few years ago, we declared that ISIS was destroyed. What just happened a couple of days ago? We bombed some camps because of who was there doing what? because of ISIS. We didn't eliminate ISIS. They reorganized, they got new leaders, they found a new place. That happens a lot too. Sometimes you completely put down the the kingdom, and sometimes you don't. So that is included in this description. Chapter 12 is going to get into some resolution to these things. But he's just describing what happens and what would happen. And so, Daniel, yes, you're going to go back home. Yes, y'all are going to reestablish yourselves in Jerusalem for a while, and then there'll be another king that comes in, and there'll be another thing that happens, and then there'll be yet another thing that happens. And none of this is outside of the awareness or control of God, and none of this is upsetting what God is doing. In fact, Babylon taking you captive wasn't undoing the work of God, they were actually doing God's bidding. God was using them. And it's really hard when you're in the circumstances to see that that's what's happening. And so what is happening here is they're pulling out and showing more of the picture so that it can be better seen and understood. You've heard the old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. You're concentrating on the tree that's right in front of you. All you see is a tree. What you're in the middle of is a wood. But you don't know that because all you see is the one tree that you're looking at. That's kind of what's happening here. Is Daniel is being refocused on a much broader scale, so he understands that each one of these things are functioning under not by God's control. In other words, God is not making the Babylonians do things, and God is not going to make Alexander do things, but they are functioning within the realm of God's control. In other words, if God didn't want it to happen, it wouldn't happen. If it was something that wasn't going to accomplish his purpose, it wouldn't happen. By the way, in what way did the rise of Alexander the Great actually help accomplish the purpose of God? Okay, he did that. Okay, so, but why was it translated in Septuagint? And why is the New Testament written in which language? Greek. Why is it written in Greek? These were Hebrews that wrote this book. They spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. Why is it written in Greek? Everybody spoke Greek. Why did everybody speak Greek? Greece is a tiny little island. Why would everybody speak Greek? They were that, and because Alexander the Great controlled the world. He controlled Northern Africa, he controlled all of Europe, he controlled this huge landmass, and everybody learned Greek. So when they translate the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language, the Septuagint, what does that do? Well, it opens up the prophecies of the Hebrew scriptures to all of the world. So that when Christ comes on the scene, they have the knowledge of the prophets about his arrival. And it enables people outside of Israel to be convinced by the gospel. And the reason the New Testament is written in Greek is because that was the commerce language of the day. Everybody spoke it. If it was written today, what language would it be written in? English. Why? Because pretty much everybody all over the world, if they get an education, gets taught English. Because the Western world is dominated by two countries. What two countries are they? United States and England, Great Britain. What language do those two countries speak? English. And so everywhere they went, especially the British, who controlled pretty much everything in the world in their day, they brought English with them. Why is South America so influenced by Portuguese and Spanish language? Because the Spanish and Portuguese, that's where they went. And that's where their people went. That's where they took over, and that's where they dominated, and their language became the dominant language in those places. Well, so when you get to the Romans also control this huge and actually expand the control beyond the Greek control up into northern Europe. What did the Romans do that was so integral to the work of God? But besides crucify the Lord, they built roads. And so as you read into the New Testament and you read about the King's Highway, or you read about the Appian Way, or you read about these routes that people traveled, those existed because of the Roman government. And those facilitated the ability of the gospel to be carried throughout the world. Those nations, as wicked as they were, did not undermine God's plan. Those nations actually, unbeknownst to them, facilitated what God wanted done. Created unified communication and the ability to travel so that the gospel could be preached and be effective. Now, not everyone could speak Greek or Aramaic. So what else did God add to that mix? The gifts of tongues in the first century. So that if you went into an area where they didn't speak the language that you spoke, what happened? I'm unlearned, I don't know the language, but I can communicate perfectly well with you the gospel. That was again to facilitate the spread of this message, the spread of this news. All of these early sermons that you read in the book of Acts, for instance, what are they based in? The Old Testament, the law and the prophets. They're all based in the Hebrew. If those people didn't have any way of knowing the Hebrew scriptures before then, before the gospel was preached, those sermons would be meaningless. But because they had already been exposed to those things, thanks to the rise of the Greek Empire, now all of a sudden the gospel makes sense to them. It's all very important, and it all helps us understand that each one of these things, despite the fact again that Alexander didn't respect the law of God, wasn't a follower of God, actually was quite arrogant and thought the world revolved around himself. He didn't stop God's plan from coming into being, and in fact, he made it possible for God's plan to be done, even though that's not what he was trying to do. And that's true with the Romans, and that's true with even people today. Not everything that happens is the will of God, but everything that happens helps do what? Helps carry out the will of God. God causes all things to work together for good. That's what that passage means. Even the wicked kings and the wicked kingdoms that do terrible things, God can use that to bring about and carry out his plan. And that is an important thing for us to learn. God's people may face powerful adversaries, but there is always an end. That's an important lesson to learn. That's the foundation of do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due time you'll reap. There's always an end, so perseverance and faithfulness will be rewarded. I don't have to give up because I think we're going to lose. Again, I think I've used this illustration before, but it makes a good one for me at least. If you've ever watched a football game and you've watched a team that stays competitive for 3 quarters and then the fourth quarter it becomes a blowout all of a sudden, if you pay close attention, what happens is one of the team quits. They give up. They think it's a lost cause. They get behind and then they think it's over. And the other team just dominates for the rest of the time. That can happen to us if we think that our adversaries have the advantage and are going to win. We quit struggling. And when we quit struggling, that's what causes us to lose. So do not grow weary in well-doing. In due time, you will reap if you do not grow weary. Persevere. The perseverance of the saints through all persecution is made possible because we know that we have hope. If we felt it was hopeless, we would stop. Gotta stop right there. Next time my plan is, and I'll go ahead and warn y'all, we will get into the weeds a little bit on this. Back in chapter 7, we were introduced to some language, time, times, and half a time. We're going to get into that in chapter 12 again. So before we get into chapter 12, we're going to do some discussion about that phrase, what it means, and the controversy around that phrase. Getting into the weeds a little bit, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that is accessible to everyone, not get too detailed. But when you deal in a study like this, there are people in the room who need more information and people in the room who aren't prepared for all the information. And so you kind of do your best to walk that line and feed the people who need it while not completely shutting down the people who. So I'm going to try not to make sure nobody gets lost. But we do want to look at that phrase, what it means, before we get into chapter 12. And that's my plan for next time.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.